Have you experienced your grandfather criticize your generation, claiming that theirs was better despite the fact that their generation was responsible for 2 world wars, an out-of-control rise in global warming, and overpopulation? It's possible that his statement should be taken with a grain of salt. When it comes to money, on the other hand, it is difficult to argue that previous generations of ultra-wealthy people lived in a manner that was significantly more extravagant than that of multi-billionaires living now. In addition to this, they had an immense wealth advantage over Genghis Khan, which was in excess of 100 trillion. Musk is like a Tashkent street rat asking for some food. Yes, people in the past had much greater material wealth. Let's take a trip through time and learn about some of the wealthiest people in history. Cornelius Vanderbilt, also known as Cornelius Vanderbilt, was a man with a reputation for being an uneducated savage who had a short temper. Nevertheless, despite the endearing nicknames that others gave him, Cornelius was one of the most influential and successful entrepreneurs in the history of the world. Some people even refer to him as the first tycoon in American history. His boorish disposition, on the other hand, had a rationale behind it. Cornelius and his family were servants when they arrived in the New World. Thus, they came from nothing. As a result, all that Vanderbilt was able to accomplish is, he accomplished it alone via his own efforts and a good sense for making financial investments. When he was 11 years old, he left school to begin working full-time on the farm that belonged to his father. When he was 16 years old, he started his own ferry service that ran between Staten Island and Manhattan. This is the one obstacle that Vanderbilt was never able to overcome. His lack of education was always right there at the edge of his pride, and it served as a constant reminder of the sacrifice he had to make in order to become the wealthiest person in the world at that time. Therefore, young people, if you are questioning why you should continue your education, the simple answer is that you need an education to be accepted by them. Or, if you still want to be taken seriously, you should have a personal fortune that is at least $185 billion, even more so if you own a railroad monopoly and personally manage all of the commerce that passes across the Hudson River. When New York was becoming the largest commercial hub in the world, naturally to get to the equivalent of $185 billion of today's money in the late 19th century, it is easy to tell that Vanderbilt was not the most pleasant person to do business with. During this time, New York was on its way to becoming the equivalent of $185 billion of today's money. He frequently engages in behaviors that are on the verge of being unlawful, such as speculation. As a result, he became known by the nickname Robert Baron. Cornelius Vanderbilt was first and foremost a builder. In spite of the fact that he had many flaws, his construction of the Grand Central Depot in New York and his sponsorship of Central University in Nashville with more than $1 million, which is equivalent to more than $70 million in today's money, would be the things that people remember most about him. Cornelius was the richest man in the world by the time he reached the end of his life because he had amassed land holdings valued more than $100 million at the time. Although for a period of time it was believed that he was the richest man in history, later estimations will indicate that he was actually only the 15th richest individual in the history of the world. Muammar Gaddafi lived his life to the fullest, outside of the law, and always looked as stoned as a gallon of Pepsi mixed with a bag of Mentos. He was a dictator of Libya. In spite of the fact that this characterization might easily be applied to any venerable music superstar, I will be referring to a world leader. However, prior to his violent death as a result of the Arab Spring and the subsequent civil war in Libya, he held a position of prominence on the global stage. Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator who managed to inspire so much notoriety all over the world and who ruled over the North African country with an iron grip for more than 42 years, is of course who I am referring to. His first item of business was to transfer the country's enormous oil assets into his own personal property, which catapulted his total wealth to more than $200 billion. This was the beginning of his rise to power. His immense riches came from a variety of sources, not just oil, but he was also involved in the drug trade, the slave trade, and acts of terrorism. Therefore, he was not the finest example for you to follow as a person to look up to. It should come as no surprise that the charismatic leader of Libya knew how to spend money in style. He fancied himself to be a style icon and would frequently change his attire, sometimes even multiple times a day. It's possible that he was an influential figure in the world of fashion when he was younger. By the 1990s, though, he had taken on the appearance of an AliExpress Lenny Kravitz. Despite this, each and every one of his garments was crafted from the finest silk, cashmere, and golden threads. Just his clothing is estimated to have cost more than several $1,000,000. However, that is nothing in comparison to his own personal tent, which he carried with him whenever he traveled outside the country. You would suppose that he brought his own place to stay because he loves camping, but the truth is that he was concerned about his safety. Gaddafi had no choice but to take refuge in the bulletproof tent since he could not put his trust in hotels to protect him when the CIA, MI6, and SAS were on their trail. In addition, Gaddafi, who was known in the West as the Mad Dog of the East, possessed 3 extravagant mansions, each of which was lavishly decked with silk, gold, and silver. In addition, the leader of Libya owned dozens of cars, 3 private jets valued at close to $200 million, and an excess of jewels. However, the thing that truly caught everyone off guard was when he hired Beyoncé to perform at a private celebration. The platform was also shared by Mariah Carey, Lionel Richie, and Usher during Queen Bey's performance. I can't help but wonder whether Gaddafi utilized Mariah Carey's "All I Want for Christmas" as a kind of torture during the interrogations. It was Henry Ford. Henry Ford was not an entirely negative figure. Henry Ford was a brilliant businessman who single-handedly propelled the American economy into its golden age. This is despite the fact that he used anti-Jewish language and was a fangirl of a specific German ruler who was famous for his hatred towards Jewish people. What was his strategy behind that? The business magnate was an advocate for a work week consisting of 5 days and 40 hours. It should come as no surprise that he did not do it out of the kindness of his heart. There are many people who continue to question whether or not he genuinely had a heart, or whether or not he actually had a Model T engine implanted inside his chest instead. No, Ford supported the demands made by the workers for a couple of important reasons. How would he accomplish the first goal, putting an end to any and all ideas of socialism in the United States? And the second goal, getting filthy rich through the sale of automobiles to his employees. Of course, if people didn't have any spare time, what would be the point of owning a car? What could they possibly need that for? In point of fact, Ford was successful in penetrating an entirely new market for his automobiles after offering them an additional day off work. And before he passed away, his strategy had been a complete success. In addition to his many factories and assets, Henry Ford had close to $250 billion. Ford didn't forget to live a little. He purchased a home with 55 rooms, as well as 1,400 acres of land. More than $3 million was spent on the estate alone back then, which is equivalent to more than $76 million in today's money. Another of his houses, which is currently listed for sale at a price of $175 million, was just recently put up for sale. It was only natural for the American manufacturer to have dozens of automobiles, watches, and everything else that contemporary billionaires would have. I can't help but wonder if Andrew Carnegie, the archetypal wealthy individual, was actually Andrew Ford. If the presence of 2 giant homes in the middle of Manhattan does not scream filthy rich, then I have no idea how to introduce Andrew Carnegie. The steel magnate had a net worth of $372 billion, which undoubtedly had a significant role in his ability to enjoy life to the fullest, because there were very few luxury commodities available, with the exception of estates and textiles. Carnegie had to conform his lifestyle to the expectations of the time, so he purchased some rather extravagant homes that were on the verge of being palaces, and then adorned them in an opulent manner. His first residence was the magnificent Carnegie Mansion, which still stands on Fifth Avenue today. It was his first house. It was among the very first homes anywhere in the world to be constructed with a steel framework and to feature both central heating and a private elevator. Having access to an elevator in those days was like to having a space shuttle in the present day. the second house was much smaller than the first, and it was located right next to the first house. It was constructed with Carnegie's daughter in mind. Carnegie, who was half Scottish, felt a strong connection to the nation that had given him his start. If you had all the money in the world and you wanted to live somewhere in your home country, what would you do? Invest in a castle, of course. Exactly. Carnegie made the purchase of an extravagant, historically significant, and authentic Scottish castle without skimping on expenses. He forked over the gargantuan sum of 3 million British pounds, which is roughly equivalent to £500 million British pounds, or $600 million in today's money, regarding both this historical site and the neighborhood in general. This is, however, just the beginning of things. Records indicate that he shelled out almost £1 billion in today's currency in order to complete the repairs. In addition, he included additional facilities that were not visible at the time of construction, such as a private indoor swimming pavilion and a private golf course. It's possible that you don't think this is a big deal, but around the turn of the 20th century, having an indoor swimming pool and a private golf course was the equivalent of having your own private Olympic stadium and organizing your own personal Olympic Games. Taking into consideration how much money the previous few Olympics cost, Carnegie could have, in fact, afforded to host the events. Carnegie was an admirable man who took great delight in making positive contributions to the world around him. That is not something that you frequently find among multibillionaires from the early part of the 20th century. However, the Scottish-American steel tycoon established a reputation for himself as one of the most generous philanthropists in the history of the world. At the end of his life, he had given away more than 90% of his fortune to a variety of charitable organizations. That right there is what I like to call a power move, donating more than $350 billion while maintaining his position as the richest man on earth. Jakob Fugger, 1459, was an especially fruitful and successful year. It's not that any year in the 15th century was particularly favorable, but there were no large outbreaks of the plague, only a few minor wars in Europe, and the War of the Roses in Great Britain was the most notable of these conflicts. However, it was a really successful year. The fact that Jakob Fugger, who would go on to become the richest man in the world, was born during this time period made everything even better. And without a doubt, one of the most important figures in the entire course of European history. In contrast to the majority of individuals living during that time, Jakob was blessed with an advantageous beginning to his existence. When he was just 12 years old, he launched his very first company. In the long run, though mine did not earn me $400 billion like mine did for me, yet, the wealthy German banker, entrepreneur, and merchant managed to amass about $500 billion, and while he did enjoy a great lifestyle thanks to his wealth, he primarily utilized it to advance his political career. When he was younger, Fugger had a lot of accomplishments to his name. According to the Testament, he was responsible for 2% of Europe's total gross domestic product at the time. That right there is a man who puts forth a lot of effort. The man's affluence served merely to highlight his already impressive intelligence. Charity served as a cover for his true motivation, which was to gain a position of authority inside the church. When the Pope nominated Carlo I, who was eventually crowned as Charles V to be the Holy Roman Emperor, Fugger spent millions of dollars building cathedrals, monasteries, chapels, and churches. As we all know, our churches were simple and uncorrupted at the time. It did not come as a surprise. Fugger supported his campaign wholeheartedly. Try to guess whether or not the poor-born German eventually attained nobility. In addition to this, he was successful in having the Pope sanction the charging of interest on loans. Up until this moment, the only people who ever engaged in the practice of lending money were Jews. This was due to the fact that the Catholic religion saw it as a mortal sin to part with money in exchange for a gain. What else could a banker do but spend a few $1 million on the construction of several dozen churches and then try to convince the Pope to allow interest to be charged on loans? After that, Fugger supported the Habsburgs financially, helping them ascend to power. The same Habsburg family that dominated Central and Eastern Europe for 3 centuries and was the driving force behind the First World War. Jakob's primary interest, apart from politics, was in exploring the world. He was a member of the first German expedition to India and also helped finance it. In addition, he led a life that may be described as really sumptuous, taking into account the standards of luxury that existed throughout the 15th century. Jakob resided in a splendid castle in Augsburg, which can to this day be toured by interested parties. Fugger was a brilliant man who is largely regarded as the father of modern banking, despite the fact that almost everyone else despised him and his ideas. And when you create 2% of Europe's GDP, well, you may deserve to have some authority over what's going to happen on the continent, especially when you're competing with other countries for that market share. When you were 12 years old, what share do you think you had of Europe's gross domestic product? Let me know what you think in the comments below. That's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to our channel Luxe Lane, and don't forget to hit the bell icon.